Very excited. We have today probably a very familiar face. The great thing about Birol is he can be the go-to guy for the EU. He can be the go-to guy for Middle East topics. He can be the go-to guy for just talking Turkey. So I think that this might be at least the third or fourth great decisions you've done for me. But Birol is professor of poli-sci and international studies here at PSU. He is also the holder of the Endowed Chair in Contemporary Turkish Studies and director of the Center for Turkish Studies in the Hatfield School of Government. Are you also interim director? He is the interim director of the Hatfield School. He came to PSU in '98 from the University of Missouri, Columbia, where he was chair of the Department of Poli-Sci. He received his BA in neurobiology from the University of California in Berkeley, his MA in Poli-Sci from San Francisco State University, and his PhD from the University of Michigan. His current research interests include global power transition, the World Values Survey, the European Union, political and economic development of Turkey, radical Islam and terrorism, the Cyprus negotiations and international conflict resolution, and politics of economic reform in the emerging markets. His recent publications include several books, EU-Turkey Relations in the 21st Century, and the Islamization of Turkey under the AKP, among others. And we are always happy to have him back. So give Birol Yesilada a big hand.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you. Thanks for coming. It's always a pleasure to talk to this group. I've really enjoyed it. We'll be going through quite a bit of material in about 30 minutes, so bear with me. And then we'll have Q&A and discussions. Things are really heating up over there, as you probably have noticed. And if you are like me and follow the Middle East, it is quite interesting. American media is not covering it as much as it should. Who would have ever thought that a day would come with grave concern that Turkish and American troops might be facing each other. They are literally a few kilometers apart in northern Syria right now. So, and these are two NATO allies. Secretary Tillerson is heading to Turkey to hold meetings this weekend, and I cannot tell you what's going to happen. I mean, it's hopefully the leaders would wake up and realize the gravity of the situation and back off. So let's see how Turkey has come to this point from being a staunch NATO ally, a model democracy in the region, to a country that is beginning to look more and more like a Middle Eastern dictatorship and questionable position in the Western world. And all of this have happened within the last decade, so rapidly. Turkey is a very complex country. This is the mosaic I put together from pictures from many places, just to give you a taste of what a complex society it is. Literally, it is a very mixed bag of different ethnic groups, religious groups that have lived in this part of the world and beyond for centuries. And at the end of the Ottoman Empire, a lot of migration took place to what is now modern Turkey. So if you were to say, you know, who actually is a Turk? And you line them up, they all look different. Because ethnically, they're very different people. But they identify as such. You can see from the east, all the way from far eastern Turkey to the Balkans, a mixed society, a mosaic that is very, very complex. The reason I'm mentioning that is today there is a new concept put forth by followers of Erdogan, and I was really puzzled personally when I first heard about it, about 10 years ago, a reference to white Turks by followers of Erdogan at TV talk shows and stuff like that. I'm going, what the heck is a white Turk compared to a dark Turk? You know, that's odd. But what they were referring to, it started sinking in once they started talking about who founded the republic. And that's Ataturk on Time magazine. And he was a fair-skinned, complexion man, blonde, sharp blue eyes, born in Salonika, as opposed to Eastern-looking Turks from Anatolia. So what they were saying was the republic was founded by converts, or what is known in Turkish as devşirme, people who converted to Islam and converted to becoming Turkic and adopting the Turkish culture and their descendants. And that's pretty much true. Most of the people were probably at one time of different ethnicities and living under an empire. What do? You either convert, or if you're in isolated areas, provinces, then you live as a nation. Turks, Ottomans were the first ones to give us that kind of rule. But predominantly, including myself and my family, we're descendants of many different ethnic groups whose ancestors converted at some time. So they're making a point that real Turks are the dark complexion Anatolian people as opposed to fair-skinned Balkan immigrants. That's another societal cleavage, if you will, that adds to the current tensions in the Turkish society. Ataturk, by all means, was a revolutionary, a visionary who decided that the future of this new republic is not going to be a continuation of the Ottoman Empire, but a brand new entity, a republic in the Western sense, to find itself among the advanced societies of Europe. So he abolished everything that was based on Islam and Sultanate. So getting rid of the caliphate, for example, is similar to if one day you wake up and somebody abolished the Vatican. Imagine that. To this day, conservative Muslims have never forgiven him for that. Brought in secular education, language, dress code, civil code rather than Sharia, modern alphabet, Latin, which fits the Turkish language better than the Arabic alphabet. And these concepts of the foundations of a republic, emphasis on republican rule, nationalism based on initially citizenship, similar to the French model. Everybody in France is called French, regardless of what they look like. And that's how it started. Later on, this became an ethnic identity and adds to societal cleavage today. For example, the biggest one threatening the country is Kurdish Turkish nationalism. But initially, what that meant was anybody who lives in Turkey, in this modern republic, is a Turk, like French. I'll explain it in a second. Revolutionary concepts, populism. Populism can be leftist and rightist. It doesn't matter. It's about providing goods, affordable goods, to common people. It has a lot to do with economic development and thinking of the larger society. Etatist is statism, state-driven economic development. At the time, modern Turkey had no capitalist class. So growth was based on state-led economic development to create an entrepreneurial class. And laïcité is loosely translated, it's a French word, into secularism. It's not the same. We Americans confuse that. And when we look at Turkey or Algeria or Tunisia, and we say, oh, they're secular. They're actually laïc. They're laicist. It's the French model where the state is above the religious institutions. It's not separate and equal like the Anglo-American model. And the reason for all that, if you notice, it has a lot of French influence. Most of the elite of the time, turn of the last century, were French educated. So they had the French concepts of development. It was a single party system for a while. Then World War II happened. They transitioned to multi-party system. And with the rise of multi-party system, the more conservative elements start re-entering Turkish politics and starts creating tension. Turkey experienced 3 military coups during its democratic period, 60 to 61, 71, 73, and then in 1980, 83. These two are the most dramatic, where the constitution was completely revised. But they were polar opposites. The 1960 military takeover led to adoption of one of the most liberal democratic constitution in the country. Whereas the 1980 coup threw it out the window and replaced it with an authoritarian constitution. And the reason for that, according to the generals, not according to me, was that the 1961 constitution was an oversized shirt for this nation, and it had to be tailored. And tailored they did. It was highly authoritarian. Since then, Turkey worked very hard under civilian governments to reform and revise that constitution in order to meet European Union's membership requirements. And by year 2002, European Union said, good enough, you're a candidate, and we will start membership talks or accession talks. And it looked pretty promising. I call it transition from authoritarianism. And since 2002, the ruling political party in a multi-party system is AKP, Justice and Development Party, led by Erdogan. Now, how that party emerged is another story. It has its roots in Islamic politics in Turkey, but when it was first created, it was a coalition of everybody who was upset with the previous traditional parties and corruption. In fact, in 2002, at the parliamentary elections, national elections, pretty much everybody was thrown out of the parliament. And this brand new party emerged like a rainbow coalition of liberals, conservatives, Islamists who call themselves reformed Islamists, former technocrats, and it looked like a new beginning was starting in the country. But pretty soon, within 5 years, things started changing, and Erdogan eliminated all the others in the party except his most closest followers and turned the party into a highly totalitarian institution. And with it, all the reforms that were achieved under pursuit of EU membership have been reversed, and with concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. So for decades, we considered Turkey a model of democracy, strong ally in NATO, unquestioned, like Britain. Dynamic economy, stable, bridge across the Bosphorus, and increasingly a transit route for energy pipelines to Europe. Still is. So what happened? We have an uncertain future. This is from the French newspaper Le Monde, where Erdogan, with Islamists, radical Islamists, is taking aim at laicite and reforms of Ataturk. It's another one. And this is more recent, saying that, you're now entering an unbelievable place. Initially, between 2006 and 2009, Erdogan allied himself with other conservatives to take on what he called and others have called deep state. Have you ever heard of that term? Okay, deep state. For years I wondered, what in the world is a deep state? And I think it was 2003 or 4, I was in Istanbul at a conference, I think it was 5, at Bilgi University. It was an international studies conference. And former President of Turkey, Süleyman Demirel, was the keynote speaker. And he was really energetic. He could hardly walk, but once he got at the podium, you couldn't stop the man. And afterwards, somebody asked him, what is the deep state? And without missing a beat, he said, the military, of course. Well, he had been jailed more than once by the military, but he always came back. What that meant is this: the Turkish military always considered itself the guardians of Ataturk's reforms and keen on defending it against domestic and foreign enemies. And whenever there was a threat of rising Islamism in Turkey, military jumped in. And they will either do it directly or, like in 1997, organize the secular institutions and interest groups, NGOs and whatnot, to create enough problems for the government to force it to resign. So, years ago, when I was looking at how Islamic politics was rising in Turkey, I came across a document which outlined how to achieve Islamic takeover. And these are real documents. I've published them in the past. One was always provide support to the biggest right-wing political party. You deliver the votes and they will protect you from the threat of the state. Second, you create an economic base to get powerful. And when you have that, you can then launch your own political party. And as of 1972, we can see the growth of these parties, one after another, successively, until now we have AKP. And there's a lineage like that. And you enter into coalitions. And in coalitions, you secure key positions in the cabinet. And you grow. You take key positions like the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Interior, and you start changing the education system. And finally, it says, and you have to be very quiet towards the military. But eventually it calls for partnership with the military and then taking over the state from within. In the 2000s, there were 2 trumped-up charges against the officers: the Ergenekon trials and the sledgehammer. And hundreds of people were arrested, thrown in jail. Never mind that last year, they all got acquitted. Many died, and they all got acquitted because Erdogan and Fethullah Gulen started to going at each other, and then Erdogan blamed Gulen for all these previous accusations against the military as phony. But initially they were together trying to get rid of the threat of the military. And they succeeded. But in 2016, there was a coup attempt in July that broke the camel's back, if you will. Gulenists led members of the military and some others. Okay, footnote, a lot of people don't believe this was a real coup in Turkey, that it was set up as an excuse for Erdogan to get rid of the rest of his enemies. Tried to carry out a coup, failed, and since then, Turkey has been living under emergency rule. What that means is that the government can pass decree with the power of law. They can just decide it, and that's it. And they changed the constitution. More powers in the hands of the president. Erdogan is the supreme leader, if you will, and they have been arresting thousands of people. The number is over 150,000 by now. Journalists, Turkey has the highest number of journalists in jail. If you dare write anything negative about Erdogan or tweet anything negative, you are in jail. 50,000 security personnel, armed forces, 1/3 of the general staff of the Turkish armed forces arrested. Right now, the operation in Syria is led by the commander of the 2nd Army, and he's a lieutenant general, not a full general. That never happened in the Republic. Never. Military judges and prosecutors dismissed, governors, judges, Ministry of Education teachers by the thousands, private schools closed, all having ties, according to the government, to Fethullah Gulen, who lives in Pennsylvania. Okay? And the other thing is, if you're arrested and thrown in jail, and the judge ruled against you already, because you can stay in jail for months before seeing a judge, the state takes over your personal possessions. Many of my colleagues have ended up in jail, some who belong to Fethullah Gülen's movement, and some who happen to be critical of Erdogan. These are professors, colleagues I've known for years. One colleague is 76 years old. He's a professor of political science, and he happened to be writing editorials. And his editorials appeared in Gülenist newspaper. He's been in jail since August 2016. State took over his personal property. And last month, the Constitutional Court of Turkey ruled that his individual rights have been violated and ordered his release. Lower courts have refused. How a lower court can refuse the Constitutional Court is beyond my comprehension. So what has he done? He has alienated the Turkish public from Europe and the United States through a massive media campaign. He destroyed Turkey's strategic partnership with Israel. He has embraced neo-Ottomanism as Turkey's new model. Though my colleagues who are Ottoman historians reassure me that these people have no idea what the Ottomans were like. He has supported radical Islamist groups. in Syria and Iraq. And in fact, the group he is supporting, the Free Syrian Army, is a bunch of al-Nusra and others who are no different than Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And the United States happens to be supporting the other group, which is dominated by Kurds who are also tied to PKK. So we got a perfect formula for massive crisis. Conservative Islam has become the base, or the basis, if you will, of new social fabric in Turkey. Laicite has been eroded, secular institutions weakened, judiciary is no longer independent, and people have started referring to him as the Sultan. All powerful, and he has actually been giving orders in every possible sector of the society and the economy, anything under the sun. He feels he is capable of making a ruling. Liberal values are rejected. What was promising for minority rights and civil rights in Turkey are now all past. And the implications are amazing. The president is not accountable to anybody. So you have a diktat of legislative majority. Judicial oversight doesn't exist. Opposition not tolerated, referred to as traitors, reminds us of that period. And a lot of similarities to 1930s Italy and Germany. There is a new police force called Special Operations, like the Gestapo. They are paramilitaries working with them. There is a new military force created within the armed forces called Endowed Organization, led by this retired general who was kicked out of the military for having radical Islamist activities, similar to SS within the military with special powers. But he's very popular. Incredibly popular. If something was to happen to Erdogan today, there would be bloodbath in Turkey within minutes. I call it the grand design of radical Islamists in Turkey to reverse Atatürk's republic. And it all started like the way I mentioned to you before. And it goes back many, many years. And it culminating right here, post-2002, and they were very clever. They came across as reformists, hide their true ambitions, and as they started getting more and more powerful, they started showing their true colors. By now, everybody knows what's going on. It's too late. So what you see is religious organizations with political ambitions creating ties to conquer the state from within. Oops. This is the list of radical Islamist organizations in Turkey. There are plenty. There are lots of them. This is a dominant nationalist vision that was created in Germany in the 1970s. Erdogan is a product of this group. He was a youth leader, a very radical militant leader, and he has now dominated the entire organization very effectively. This is the Gulen Organization globally, the imam who lives in Pennsylvania. very powerful. We estimate the net worth of the organization, huge business enterprises, to be around $40 billion. So you put the two together, you get a formidable coalition. I once asked the journalist, why isn't Gulen returning to Turkey now that all charges against him were dropped? This was about 8 years ago. He said Erdogan doesn't want him there because he wants no competition. And now they're enemies. So in the past, they were together. This is Erdogan, it's a young man. This is Fethullah Gulen. And today, they're pointing fingers at each other for wrongdoings and corruption. What about the Turks? Let me explain this very quickly. We have surveys around the world. Sometime, if you have free time, look up World Values Survey on the web and play with the data. And it's every 5 years. And there are two general indexes created from conservative religious to secular along this line. So secular here, religious here. And over here, we have materialist, selfish values to postmodern, post-materialist values. And these are averages every survey for a country. Like, here's the United States, going towards more, towards the middle of the secular religious, but losing some of its post-materialist values. Here are the Europeans. Look at Sweden, Norway. Very secular, very postmodern. It's like environmental consciousness, recycling, freedoms, and human rights, animal rights, and things like that. As opposed to over here, you will get me, and the heck with the environment, as long as I make $1. So these are the post-Soviet countries. Here is Turkey. Look how far away it is from rest of Europe. In another way, when you look at the distance of average values between the Germans and the Turks, right there. Netherlands, Turks, look at Turkey, Iran, Egypt. It's getting closer and closer to the conservative Muslim societies than the European societies. If you look at this map alone, this tells me this country can never join those countries. They just don't fit. And that reinforces Erdogan's goal of keeping Turkey further and further away from Europe. It's easier. All you have to do is convince the people that they don't want you anyway. Let me just pass this. They're very different right now. So what makes him popular? Charisma. Very charismatic. Good communicator. Populist policies. If you go to Ankara and Istanbul today, you will not see shanty towns. They're all gone. Shanty towns all around the urban cities have been raised, new buildings, new neighborhoods, and all the previously poor people are now living there. Compliments of the state. It's an easy way of getting votes. Populist policy. Neo-Ottomanism, the glorious past. All the authoritarian leaders emphasize that. We're going to make Turkey great again. In the image of the Ottomans. But we don't know what the Ottomans were. Never mind that. We'll just dress like them. Anti-Western, blame the United States for everything. Accumulation of wealth, creating enemies, and there is a strong appeal for strong leaders among the public. And US policies in Iraq and Syria. I mean, it's a very dangerous neighborhood. Okay, what are they trying to do over here? Well, they got one thing right. They're worried about PKK. That's the Kurdish guerrilla organization, Marxist-Leninist, which now embraces Kurdish nationalism to appeal to larger Kurdish elements. But if you ask the Kurds in northern Iraq, what do you think of PKK? They make a distinction. The Barzani, Talabani Kurds are very worried about PKK. Okay, a lot of Kurds in Turkey, 18 million of them. Not everybody is a supporter of PKK. In fact, there is a radical Islamist Kurdish group as powerful as PKK that the state has repeatedly used against the PKK and its sympathizers, called the Kurdish Hezbollah. So just keep that in mind. This is not a homogeneous group here. But PKK is operating in northern Iraq and now operating in northern Syria. And since the collapse of ISIS, PKK has taken control of the corridor from northern Iraq through northern Syria, threatening the entire southern border of Turkey. That's why the Turks are now in Syria. Because they kept telling us, the United States, don't permit this. It has happened with American support. And they will do whatever it takes to prevent Kurdish state on their southern border. And reason? They fear that this will lead to civil war within Turkey. Now, many of us believe that there's already civil war in southeastern Turkey. And it's been going on. So, this is Syria. And this is the region that the PKK-linked Syrian Kurds are now controlling. And they were going to control this area, and the Turks first went in here with the Syrian Free Army and established control. That's the Euphrates River. And 2 years ago, United States told the Turks the Kurds will not be permitted to go west of the Euphrates to Manbij. But they did. So Ankara is very upset about that. And when there was a danger of these two corridors connecting, they went in and occupied it. Let me show you another map. I mean, who supports who in a given day in Syria is now a big question. This is a better way of looking at it. Here are the Turks, Al-Bab. Here are the Syrian Kurds, Manbij, and US Special Forces are right here. These are the other Kurds connected to these guys here in Afrin, and that's where the Turkish operation is taking place. That started 3 weeks ago, right here. This is a region jointly controlled by Russians, Turks, and the Free Syrian Army. And this is the Turkish operation right now. And this is as of today. They control these regions, and they suspended air campaign for 4 days and restarted again. There's Afrin. And Erdogan is saying, once we clean up Afrin, we're going to control all of this. Our next move is going to be this. See that flag? Those are the US troops. They were placed there to prevent the Turks from attacking Kurds here. But Erdogan is saying that we want them out of this entire region to east of Euphrates. And the CENTCOM commander, General Votel, made it very clear that we're not going to move anywhere. So now everybody's worried sick that Turkish and American troops are going to be facing each other very, very soon. They can already see each other Now, Erdogan has a couple of other crises with the United States. Never mind that the United States helped them immensely to gain legitimacy, run for elections. He was received in the White House. He was a great ally working with the United States until things started going south. One is he wants Gulen extradited. And he doesn't seem to understand the fact that judiciary does not jump when the politicians say jump in the United States. This is a court case, and he has no evidence to support it. For example, they apparently delivered some documents where people confessed that they were under the orders of Gulen. Then there are pictures of these guys all beaten up. What judge is going to take that evidence seriously when you have pictures of blatant torture? So nobody's making a move. Second is something I called Erdogan's Iran Gate. Have you heard about that? It's a case in New York where an Iranian-Turkish businessman, gold trader, escaped to the United States, was arrested, and cut a deal with the prosecution. And he is spilling the beans. The chairman or the former chairman of Halk Bank of Turkey is arrested, found guilty, and they used a very complex scheme to get around American embargo of Iran for oil and gold trade. It was very, very complex. This guy's name is Reza Zarab, and they want him extradited to Turkey. It's not happening. So let me show you what the map chart looks like. Here is the operation within Turkey. In China, there's also Russia, that is in a second chart I didn't put, Ghana, Dubai, Iran. It's a very complex set of operation. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps billions. And it went on for a long time. Nothing happens in Turkey without approval of Erdogan. Nothing. Especially something this complex. So the fear is that this is going to blow up in his face, and the sooner it is shut down, the better it is for Erdogan. So what has happened? I call it Islamization of Turkey. A friend of mine calls it Arabization of Turkey. And she's got a good reason, because there's a particular set of values being imported into Turkey. Strategic alliance with the West and Israel is being destroyed. Personal ties with rich Gulf state leaders emphasized. Anti-Americanism is at an all-time high, even higher than in 1976 Cyprus arms embargo period. And part of it is this. United States and Western world support of Erdogan also alienated secular Turks. They're upset. So everybody is upset. The Islamists hate us to begin with, and the seculars are mad that they feel we sold them out. So at the end, we can say liberal democracy in retreat, no longer a model. Economic challenges are immense. They really are. Never mind the macro growth picture they're giving us. There are a lot of problems in there. And a lot of us are now saying, we will be asking, who lost Turkey? It's a very complex question. And we're seeing this happening a lot. Erdogan repeatedly going to Putin, repeatedly cutting deals with the Chinese, and asking to join the Shanghai Five organization. Even a Russian general said, well, how the heck are you going to be joining Shanghai 5 as a member of NATO? You have to leave NATO first. So, didn't we see this coming? Why did the EU turn its back on Turkey? Let's also not forget that, which just added more to the side of Erdogan and his followers. What's behind the Chinese and Russian ideas here? I'll tell you in a second. And that is, what is Putin trying to do with the Chinese? They're forging an alliance. It's not an easy alliance. Bear that in mind. But their goal is to destabilize the transatlantic alliance. And Turkey is one of the strongest members of the transatlantic alliance. NATO without Turkey will become incredibly weak and lose all its advantages in the Middle East. It's a very important ally. And if you say why, I'll say location, 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 and also this tremendous fighting force that they have. And if you take that out of NATO's arsenal and the political mix, the balance of power shifts. Literally. I think somebody in the Trump administration last week finally said that Putin is trying to damage U.S.-Turkey relations. Well, good morning. Thank you.
Okay, I see a hand here.
One thing you didn't touch upon that adds to the complexities is the Sunni-Shia dynamic, with Turkey being predominantly Sunni, as I understand it, and of course Iran predominantly Shia.
That's in the regional dynamics. Right now in the region, you have a competition between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran for hegemony. And what's happening in Iraq and Syria and other places is a proxy war. In fact, the Turks are setting up a base in Qatar. They send their troops, and they're going to increase it to a brigade size. When everybody else is threatening Qatar, the Turks are setting up a base. They're also setting up a base in Somalia. Very interesting development. Now, the hidden factor there is these are medium powers who also have their friends higher up at the systemic level: United States, Russia, China. And when you look at the power dynamics, what happens at the regional level is going to have tremendous implications for the systemic balance. It's a very interesting interplay of politics and strategic relations. So yes, we do have a competition, and there the two contenders are Turkey and Iran. And it's uneasy relationship. It may look like they're cooperating, but they really are not. They're also in very fierce competition. And Iran is very unhappy with the Turkish military move right now.
Thank you for your very interesting but somewhat frightening presentation. In the article in the Foreign Policy Association booklet, the author makes the point that experts on Turkey in the State Department have a very European perspective. They're experts on the EU, on NATO, and Turkey, as it's moving more toward the Arab Middle East alignment, needs to have experts in those areas. Is anybody advising Tillerson who has any expertise on Turkey today?
I haven't been there lately, but it is generally true. And that's the reason, because Turkey in the State Department is in Europe, not the Middle East. And we always maintain Turkey in Europe. Now, about 10 years ago, they did some reorganization on the Intel side and split up the small group that was forever present in Intel. It was Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, and put Turkey more with Syria and Iraq. They split up that group, which has its advantages and also disadvantages. You're gaining something and losing something else here. Let's not forget that we have not resolved the Aegean crisis. In fact, today I was looking at the news, Turkish news, and I read something that really frightened me. The head of the Turkish General Staff, the top dog of the Turkish military, said that we are powerful enough to carry out our military operations in Syria and defend our interest in the Aegean. That's towards Greece, because there have been an increase in tension over territorial waters as of late. That's frightening. When a country's leaders start thinking that they can carry out two wars simultaneously, that's very frightening.
What do you see as the end game for Erdogan? Is it something, there was a reference in the article about Gaullism, and I don't have a firm grasp on that. That happened when I was younger, but France separated itself from Europe. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I can, and I do know the author you read. He's a very nice, bright young scholar, researcher. It's not as much as Gaullism. Gaullism, the only similarity there is distancing Turkey from NATO militarily, more independent foreign security policy, but there is also some similarity to feeling of this imperialist power. De Gaulle was an imperialist, no doubt. And he always, whenever he had an opportunity to practice that, he did. Well, so does Erdogan, except he's got a problem. Nobody else wants him in the region. You know, when he goes and says, we are going to be the defender of the faith, the Arab state says, who asked you? Except the Hamas. He happens to be friends, you know, buddies. Morsi, when he was in power, was forcing an alliance with him, but he's out. They had this grand vision that between Egypt and Turkey, they were going to redesign the Middle East with US assistance. Well, it didn't happen. So the similarities are somewhat there, but not deep. Because unlike de Gaulle, Erdogan has no idea what the Ottomans were like.
I just had a quick question. I know that you had briefly just touched base on the question before the previous one about Greece and Turkey and problems with territory. I know that there had been past problems with territory with Turkey and Greece coming up on actually Eleftheria, Greek Independence Day, and I was wondering what you think the likelihood of that conflict reoccurring in a more of a battle sense, I would say.
I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, because what they did was separate Cyprus from other bilateral issues, because Cyprus has been a pain for them. And as soon as they did it, they started improving bilateral relations. The economic interdependence between Greece and Turkey is pretty good. And a lot of good things are happening. Just that there's some rocks, they're not even islands, rocks that are disputed. And trigger-happy naval officers challenge each other in the region. Jets still fly. But at the same time, banking system integrated. They even have a gas pipeline from Turkey to Greece, and things are, people are investing in each other's economies. Those are all good developments. And on Cyprus, they are not on different pages as much as they used to be. So I don't expect it, except this is just a nuisance right now. Now, if Erdogan were to go totally ballistic, I have no idea what a madman would do. May I add one thing? When you look at leaders who acquire a lot of power in history, Erdogan is just another one like them. Another Mussolini, another Hitler in the sense of feeling invincible, more and more powers, and everybody around them is a yes man. And that creates a very dangerous scenario for a country.
Yes. Are more women wearing head coverings now in Turkey? And what are some of the manifestations of the growing misogyny?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And that is because the education system has changed. They've been in power since 2002. That's enough time to carry out social engineering. All of the public schools now have very strong Sunni-focused Islamic education. Yeah. Now, when you look at the laicist systems, and here we didn't help the Turks, I don't think. We don't understand the fact that under laicite, any religious clothing is not permitted in the public sphere. Privately, nobody cares, okay? But if you're a judge, you're a teacher, you go to a public institution, you cannot wear the hijab. And hijab, by the way, is not integral to Turkish social culture. It's imported deliberately from the Middle East. Turks make a distinction, those sociologists and cultural anthropologists, friends who research this, they make a distinction between hijab or turban in Turkish versus headscarf, which would be similar to the Balkan woman. Okay, now that's Turkish. But this very tight hijab is not. You would see that in southeastern Turkey among the Kurdish population, and it would be white. Black chador started re-entering Turkish culture in the 90s. There was none. It was discarded. If I were to show you contrast of Turkish women in the streets in the 60s, 70s, 80s to now, you'll be shocked. There are regions of Istanbul that if you go in to those neighborhoods, you think as if you're in Tehran, except they're changing in Iran. 5 years ago, I was at a conference. You know the name Bernard Lewis? And we started talking, and he said to me, I'm afraid Iran's going to become Turkey and Turkey is going to become Iran. And it's happening.
Does Erdogan have somebody who would follow on if anything happens to him, or is there anyone that strong to follow him?
No. Leaders like that have nobody following them because they're too afraid of being taken down. In fact, that's an excellent question. When the Justice and Development Party was established, said it was like a rainbow coalition. It had 3 strong Islamic leaders, all from the same political party who rebelled against the old guard and called themselves reformists. Now, when you ask them, how are you reformist? What are you doing to be a reformist Muslim? You never got a clear answer. And then in those days, I wrote that if these guys were really interested in it, to reform political Islam in Turkey and create a political party with religious foundation, but more like the Christian Democrats in Europe, Turkey will jump another league in political development. But if they revert back to the old guard's practices, Turkey is doomed. What he did, as soon as he saw that the other 2 could be challengers to his position, he eliminated them one by one.
Yes, you mentioned the Turkish military a while ago. Can you tell us where they got their military weapons, and if from America, were they given to or sold to them by Americans?
They buy. They don't
have any?
They buy stuff, but I would say the defense industry's Turkey today is sufficient to supply 60 to 70% of what they need.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 30 years ago, it wasn't like that. It is now. Very advanced. They can build anything, practically, except airplane. They have their, those drones, what do we call them? That carry missiles. They have a drone. Yeah, they have them. They built their own. They have built their own missiles. They're embarking on building their first main battle tank. They build ships, submarines. It's very advanced. Yeah, no. The one time where they took a lot of gifts from the United States, and they weren't the only ones, Italians, Spanish, Greeks. After Reagan, Reagan wanted to build a 700-ship Navy, right? So we built all these destroyers. And then we didn't have the manpower, human power. So we handed them out to our NATO allies. So they got a few of those. But other than that, they built their own F-16s under license. And they are one of the NATO partners participating in the production of the F-35. Yeah.
I'd like to know more about the Kurdish situation. You talked about the PKK and that the Kurds are not necessarily all of one mind. And then you talked about the Iraqi Kurds and the Syrian Kurds. And so I wanted to understand what you think the possibilities are on the whole Kurdish question. Because this is the first time I really understood that the PKK wasn't, that the other Kurds weren't eager to ally with the PKK.
PKK started as literally a student organization in the 70s. Radical student organization in 1980 when there was a coup in Turkey. I was a graduate student in Michigan. And I sat down with another friend who's an economist who now teaches in Turkey. And we started counting all the leftist student organizations in Turkey, and we stopped at 102. So some of them were large, some of them were like 2-3 guys. And they all saw each other as enemies because every group thought they knew Marx and nobody else did. PKK literally was a militant Marxist-Leninist group, which all the other non-Marxist Kurds hate it. And when they started their campaign against the state, they made no distinction between who's a Kurd and who's a Turk in slaughtering. As long as you work for this state, you are an enemy. So they didn't make many friends. But today, because of state's repression of the Kurds in general, fearing that every Kurd is alike and a potential terrorist, people are becoming more and more sympathetic to PKK. I can tell you hundreds of stories where brothers faced each other, one in the military and one in PKK, and families torn apart. So this is a very complex issue. Post-1980, the state embarked on a policy of denying Kurdish identity and calling them mountain Turks. I remember in '87 when I was on a research trip to Turkey, I was running a furnished apartment, and it had an old Turkish encyclopedia in its library. And I said to my wife, I wonder how the Kurds are defined in this Turkish encyclopedia from 1958. So I looked it up, and it literally said this: Kurds are an ethnic minority living in Turkey of Aryan ethnic background who are all Muslims by and large, and they're Sunni. So how did they all of a sudden become mountain Turks in 1982?
Anyway, we are out of time. Let's give Birol a big hand.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim.